you have changed your attitude toward capitalism recently. I kind of go into that a little bit with you. You wrote on Reddit that you have to make capitalism work. This sickens me considerably, but I'm holding my nose and going for it. On Twitter, you said capitalism is coercion because passive property is murder, and markets and terrorism are both violence. Are the statements hyperbolic or literal? Like, what did you mean? Can you go into that?
Look, 20 million people are going to die this year of poverty. 20 million. That's the same number that Hitler killed in the entire Holocaust process. Right? 6 million Jews, gypsies, cripples, schizophrenics, gay people, Freemasons, political opponents, 20 million people. Every year, in a world which produces twice the number of calories that we need to feed the entire human race, 2 or 3 million people will die of starvation. 20 million people will die of things like lack of vaccinations, dirty indoor air because they're cooking on 3-stone fires. We're in a position where the right of the rich to stay rich, the right of the middle class to stay middle class, is directly producing abundant death. If these people had the right to simply walk into our cities and take what they needed to survive, we wouldn't have 20 million deaths a year from poverty.
So is that the connection between capitalism and the poverty?
Yeah. It's very, very simple, right? When you set up a system of property rights where it is legal for somebody to starve to death, but illegal for them to steal food, the system of law that you have is producing death.
So that's the system of law, but what does that have to do with capitalism?
Property rights. Capitalism is rooted in strong property rights. Property rights are rooted in the existence of the state.
So capitalism is impossible without the state?
You can't separate markets from governance. Markets and governance are single processes. There are no markets without governance. There's no governance. There's no way to separate the market from the governance.
So even in the case of black markets, the governance is trying to get in there and do stuff, and it's still
mafias, right? Mafias.
Oh, okay, that's a type of governance, right?
Yeah, governance, not government, right?
Right. Yeah,
As soon as two people try and make an agreement, right? If something goes wrong, they either fight with each other, or they say fuck it and walk away from the deal, or they go to a third party for dispute resolution. And if that third party is doing most of the dispute resolution for most of the people, they become essentially a government.
Right.
Or at least they become governance of a kind that is indispensable. Most of the places you look historically, these big marketplaces, the bazaars, are taxed, and the tax is used to pay the soldiers that protect the bazaar. There's never really been large-scale market activity without something resembling the state to support it. And to all intents and purposes, the free market is the product of the state.
Well, even any time in history, I don't know, Neolithic or...
There's always going to be a weird counterexample here or there. Right?
Okay.
But most of the historical evidence, as I understand it, is that states create markets. The need to protect the people who are trading turns into the ability to raise taxes to pay for the protection, turns into somebody who makes a decision about what is right and wrong.
So how do we, there's these people that call themselves anarcho-capitalists, which in this instance would be considered an oxymoron. So how, but it's kind of an ideal, maybe. So,
no, not for me. Because the problem with anarcho-capitalism is defining property. Right? Your version of anarcho-capitalism assumes that songs can be copyrighted.
No, well, I don't know about that. Right? I don't know about that.
Well, let's say it as an example, right?
Well, I don't think that's a good example because very few anarcho-capitalists believe in intellectual property, so maybe a different example.
Yeah, but plenty of them do, right?
Oh, God, they're idiots.
Look, they may be idiots, but let's just take this as an example, right? Okay. So you've got your idiotic anarcho-capitalists who believe in copyright, right? Who meet a bunch of anarcho-capitalists that don't believe in land ownership. Right? We believe that land should be, is obviously just like air. We don't talk about air ownership. We've got these enormous buffalo ranges where the buffalo go backwards and forwards freely, and then we hunt the buffalo that cross in the places where we happen to be that year. And your idea that land can be owned is absurd as their idea that music can be owned. Right? So when you get two different systems of property rights meeting each other, what you get is a bunch of anarcho-capitalists waving bones in the air and arguing why their culturally constructed form of property is actually natural law. And as soon as you question the existence of absolute land tenure as being an integral human right, the entire system of anarcho-capitalism falls to pieces because we can't define property well enough to define what constitutes non-aggression.
Right. I think it does
right?
come down to non-aggression, but I think there's the scarcity, of course, at the root of property, where that's an essential difference between, say, land and intellectual property. But
let's drill down on this a little more carefully. This is super important, right?
Yeah.
So when you've got two groups of people that both call themselves anarcho-capitalists meeting from two different cultures,
Yeah.
the problem is figuring out how property is defined, right? Because there's a whole bunch of weird voodoo in everybody's definition of property. For example, water rights in the eastern US and the western US operate on a completely different legal basis, right? Resulting in different people getting their land destroyed by drought, depending on which side of the Rockies you're on, basically. Right? So, same thing with land rights. UK has this weird system of leasehold and freehold. It's crackpot. It's left over from the feudal era, but it's completely baked into our land tenure system. You go to America, the separation of land from mineral rights. Huge weirdness around that. So whenever you get two different groups that construe property in different ways meeting, trade is impossible because they can't agree what it is that is being traded and how, and the machinery necessary to make that agreement uniform turns into de facto state.
Right. I agree with that completely.
And there's no way of objectively defining what property is or what property rights should be because every culture in the world has a different story about that stuff.
What about
there's a fantasy in the anarcho-capitalist world that we could come to a single common universally agreed on intercultural agreement about what property is, and that's just not true.
There's some relatively hardline anarchist thinkers such as Jeffrey Tucker. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He definitely said explicitly that he believed property was only that which somebody could defend themselves.
Yep.
And so that would be a somewhat decentralized view of property, but of course it's kind of a warlord, road warrior-ish, if you really take it to the extreme. So is that something to work toward that would work? That maybe could work through conventions? No, you think it's undoable?
Well, the reason it's undoable is as soon as you've got groups of people that disagree about what property is, they can't trade without one side or the other side feeling like theft is occurring. And the process of negotiating a single universal property standard for the entire world is just as bad as negotiating a single universal language for the entire world. So when anarcho-capitalists say, well, we've got this system of property rights and it's going to work for the entire future of humanity, it's like saying, well, what we've got to do is we've got to teach all of the natives English, and once they can all speak English properly and they understand all of our words, then they'll agree with all of our ideas. Right? The anarcho-capitalists have no way of dealing with cultures that construe property differently, because when two cultures meet with different ways of construing property, trade is almost impossible. It tends to turn into violence because both sides assume that theft is happening. So until you've got some kind of protocol where two groups of people can meet and agree how property will be defined for their interactions, it's extremely difficult to get anywhere. And when I raise this kind of discussion with anarcho-capitalists, by and large what happens is a whole bunch of jawing about how actually absolute land tenure is obviously what animals do in nature and therefore is correct, and all of the different examples of land rights from around the world that other human cultures have practiced get steamrollered in this completely racist imperialist way. They're uninterested in understanding that the rest of the world manages land differently from Western Europeans, and as a result they go out in this completely unconsciously racist way talking about how Western European land rights constitute good governance of property. I just don't know where to begin with these people.
So, Vinay, do you think that technology could be of any assistance in creating some sort of decentralized trading paradigm for property management?
Well, so let's start with big objective goals, right? Big objective goals, humanity doesn't kill itself with technology, right? I mean, we ought to start with the idea that not killing our own species is a fundamental output that is necessary for all political work. If it's not going to keep us alive, it's not worth doing. Right? So that means that any kind of system politics we're talking about has to put climate right at the top of the list. It's got to deal with nuclear weapons. It's got to deal with nanotech risk. It's got to deal with biotech risk. And if we're not dealing with those things, we've also ought to be factoring in things like asteroid scanning. If we're not factoring those things into our political thought, it's not that we're wrong, it's that we're irrelevant. It doesn't matter whether we succeed or whether we fail, we might still all get wiped out by our own stupidity. So I don't think it particularly matters what systems we use for managing trade, right? High taxes, low taxes, right wing to the point of being practically fascist, left wing to being practically communist. If it's all running on carbon, I don't think any of these systems have a better chance of survival than any of the others. The differences between all of these political options are extremely small when compared to survival-oriented politics or survival careless politics. And almost the entire political spectrum is made up of survival careless politics. It's a whole bunch of people yapping about whatever their local priorities are and acting as if this is the highest goal of all political thought, while we are shoving the entire repository of all life that we are aware of in the entire universe off a cliff made entirely of handbags. Right?
A cliff of handbags.
We're destroying the world for an enormous pile of consumer goods. Don't need any of this crap.
So how do we use this? Comes back to the precautionary principle, right? How do we use it to determine the correct course? I mean, for example, in the climate debate, there is a lot of information out there, and I personally don't think that anyone really knows what's happening in that. Now, with replicator tech, the risks are very clear. With climate, we're just really, really guessing here. We don't have enough firepower on in our CPUs to be able to really actually model every atom. And until we do, we're running on fumes here. We're kind of guessing, and the scientific consensus turns over so fast. It's incredible. So I don't necessarily think we're going to be warming, cooling. I think we don't know. So how do we move forward with that lack of conclusion?
Well, so let's talk about processes first, right? I think the problem is that we've got essentially a Marxist perspective on everything. Let me explain what I mean by that. So Marx decides that the conflict between rich and poor, class war, is the core of politics. And that idea that class war is the core of politics, that all politics is about resolving conflicts between the classes in one way or another, has pervaded the entire Western political landscape to the exclusion of all other principles. The libertarians are in a tiny little corner saying, no, it's not about class war, it's about freedom. And you could say there are a few anarchists over there, but generally speaking, the entire political space is constrained by the idea that politics is about class war. After the invention of the nuclear weapon, class war became irrelevant. The real politics was about survival or death. But we've never really managed to break free of cross-war politics and say, look, the real politics is survival or death. I am in the survival camp. What about you? So if we had large-scale political movements that said the first job of all political work is to make sure that the human race survives, it would be nice if most of the animals around us survive too, because I don't think we can live without them. What is bad for them will eventually be bad for us, so let's just protect nature as a whole. Let's also start thinking seriously about things like managing the asteroid risk, because we've got the capability to do it. Let's think about managing the technology risk, because these things are really dangerous and we shouldn't be doing them next to our life. Right? If you had a large-scale political movement towards life-based politics, right? This is the politics of survival. We're going to make sure the human race survives. That's our number one job. After that, we're going to deal with the rest of these problems. I think if you saw that, we could, a large-scale movement based around that kind of principles could very easily break the entire culture out of the Marxist dialectic. And I think the libertarians have shown that you can get very large-scale political change simply by sticking to your principles. And if I could figure out the rest of that political platform in some kind of coherent way, I might be willing to give it a push. But I'm not there yet. I need a bit more time to get my head together on this. And I'm sort of hoping that somebody will get there first and I can just follow. That'd be really nice.
Prout, right?
Prout is good, but Prout is pre-nuclear. I mean, okay, it was cooked in the 1970s, but it was cooked in the 1970s without an explicitly survival orientation. It's still largely, now, this is where the limits of knowledge on Prout may be important. So there may be a book by Ananda Murthy, which is basically like, oh yeah, and here's everything I think about nukes, and I just haven't read it. But the Prout material I've been exposed to does not start with by the way, the entire planet is in danger from human stupidity. Maybe we should do something about this.
How do we
Instead,
get from here to survival-based politics? Is that what you're still trying
well,
to figure out?
I mean, this is the first time that the word survival-based politics has come out of my mouth, so maybe that's a beginning, right? I've
Yeah,
had the thought for a long time, but I've never found the words for it, so, maybe that's a start, right?
I'm looking forward to my footnote in history.
Well, I mean, maybe you'll figure out the rest of the platform and go forth and conquer.
Cool, man. I'll let you know.
Sure.
Something interesting that you've said recently that I thought really hadn't been elucidated publicly was you were tweeting about the prevalence of mild autism in the information technology community and its effect on society via the work they do. Is this
Yeah, sure.
is it a revenge of the nerds, and what is its importance?
Well, I don't think it's revenge of the nerd. I mean, first thing is, we all know that computer programming tends to bring out whatever autistic traits people have already, right? Even neurotypical people, after 3 or 4 weeks staring at compiler messages, begin to act like autistic people, right? So whatever it is, I don't know whether the initial consciousnesses that came up with computing were extremely autistic. Like, for example, I don't know whether von Neumann had autism, but there seems to be such a tight link between autism and computers that it's just there. That's what we're dealing with. So, I mean, I know myself, right? I went back. I've largely been dealing with human beings in English for about 10 years. 3 or 4 years ago, I spent 6 months doing a full stack programming gig because I had an idea that I wanted to do a prototype of, and I thought, how hard can it be? Within a month, I'd lost all of my social skills, and it took weeks of not writing code every day for that stuff to come back again.
Yeah,
And
it's almost like software itself is like a concrescence of the autistic angle of humanity.
yeah, absolutely, right. So, I mean, I jokingly talk about this as being the rise of the nerd Reich, that we're winding up in a position where autistic people are the only people that can understand the tools that they've created, and these tools are what run the rest of society. So we're winding up with an enormous bias towards autistic values
Say that
in
again.
ways
Normally biased.
we're winding up with an enormous bias towards autistic values in ways that may cause people an awful lot of trouble in the long run.
Hasn't this just been going on for a long time? I mean, the first bone that was used to crush, a turtle shell, or that could have. I wouldn't be surprised if that was an autistic guy who was just thinking it through 70,000 years ago.
Certainly could be, but I think there's no denying that computer programming has given autistic people an enormous route to success and power. It's way easier for autistic people to get ahead in the world than it was. They're getting preferentially hired by a lot of organizations. It's pretty well understood in tech companies, like, the force is strong in this one, right?
Right.
And that this person will be fantastic at their job, because they've got the knack, right? It's like you can just tell this guy's going to be a really good programmer. How can you tell? Well, there's a certain flatness of affect, the voice is, and everybody knows that implicitly what you're discussing is this guy is really kind of nerdy, which is a code phrase for this guy is somewhere on the autism spectrum. So the idea that the autists might be the first group where what was previously considered to be a disability winds up being socially converted to a superpower, I think that's really interesting. Like, we are not used to the idea of disabled people ruling and governing because their disability turns out to be enormously socially productive and powerful. And I would love to see, for example, how the identity politics people deal with that. How do you figure out a politics of identity or an intersectionality where a group that was previously stigmatized and punished for their neurological makeup become lionized and become heroes because of it? It'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the next 10 or 20 years. But I think that we've got to face the fact that we're dealing with a population that was previously considered to be disabled and are still disabled in many ways, but are also turning out to be, super empowered relative to the jobs they're doing in technology. And, I really feel like the neurotypical, folks need to start really thinking about, okay, so we agree that the autistic folks are incredibly good at building the technology that we use. And I don't want to be fetishistic about this, right? It's not that all autistic people are great programmers. It's not that all great programmers are autistic. It's that there is a huge overlap between the two areas that we all know about that we don't talk about very much. So I wonder whether what happens over time is that we wind up having to build corrective mechanisms where we can explain to these folks, okay, look, so here are 250 neurologically typical people that have looked at the system that you've built, and here are 3 things that you need to add to it before it causes us no pain. And it becomes like, what happens when your lead graphic designer happens to be colorblind, right? You have somebody check every time the work goes out that it makes sense. And things like that happen, right? I mean, we're used to working around the limitations of other people's sensoria. And I think that we might discover that in the long run, learning how to build systems which compensate for the weaknesses that sometimes go with autism turns out to be a really important part of our political culture. Because if we're going to have large-scale infrastructure which is built by people who have autism, or is built by teams in which autism is prevalent, you're going to discover that there are gaps that neurotypical people would have caught. So I think it's very much about partnership. How do we make sure that we balance these teams in such a way that we get the best of all worlds? And that applies to other kind of non-neurotypical standard types as well. For example, GCHQ apparently preferentially hires dyslexics because they're really good at organizing information.
Wow.
Yeah. I was really sorry. I read it in The Guardian, right? But, apparently this is so. And it kind of makes a bunch of sense. I had somebody, this is so good. So I met with a lawyer recently, right? And midway through the conversation, the lawyer points out that I'm dysgraphic. And I'm like, how did you know? And he's like, it's the way that you use models to structure reality. I'm like, and it was amazing. Like I'd been totally busted. Oh my God. And, I don't know very many people with dysgraphia. So the idea that we all basically build models because we can't work with language properly is amazing. Like, this is really cool.
Dysgraphia is when you have difficulty writing. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's basically like output stage dyslexia. But dyslexia, generally speaking, is pretty constant over a lifetime. Dysgraphia, lots and lots of people with dysgraphia get most of their function back between 16 and 25. So I got back basically everything except the ability to drive, which is really inconvenient.
Oh, man. Wow.
I can't judge distances properly when I'm in motion.
Oh, wow.
It's a really subtle neurological glitch. It damn near caused a car accident when I was learning to drive. And after that, it was like, oh, I can't do this.
So no fighter pilot, Vinay.
Well, I mean, as long as I can do it with one eye closed, maybe I don't have to judge distances.
Yeah. Well, my dream is to get an anti-gravity UFO, so maybe we'll fly around in that. I'll give you a shot at the controls.
Self-driving cars, right?
Oh, yeah, that solves your problem.
Oh, so I cannot wait to not be disabled, right? The idea that I could just get into a self-driving car just like everybody else gets into a self-driving car, and I could say, see that mountaintop over there? Take me as close to there as you could get, and then you could just drive into the backwoods in a self-driving car. Oh my God, I can't imagine how much I want this to be true.
Yeah, no, I can definitely imagine. That comes back to to this idea of people who have disabilities, being able to leverage their other skills in society. You're a perfect example. Somebody with extreme dysgraphia and other problems. You've leveraged your other abilities in a really great way.
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, most of my neurological shit came together as I got older. And I'm pretty convinced that video games got me over the first hump and meditation got me over the second.
The magic of video games.
Tai Chi as well. Well, yeah, dyspraxia and video games, there's a huge relationship. Lots of kids that are dyspraxic, they're not properly coordinated, you stick them in front of video games, come back 3 years later and they're like doing card tricks with 2 hands. So, there's a huge healing effect of video games. Mom. And Tai Chi just speaks for itself, right? If you've got any kind of movement disorder, if anything is going to help, Tai Chi is well up the list of things to try.
Yeah, Tai Chi helped me a lot too in my teens. I was not a natural athlete, never have been. A little bit slightly clumsy, and Tai Chi made me way other side.
Yeah. It's amazing. It really is. That thing where like you've been doing Tai Chi for a few years, and the first time you knock something off a table and catch it on the way down.
I don't know if I got to that level, but certainly helped my dancing.
Ah, interesting. I have a friend whose mother has got like way into Tai Chi quite late in life. And apparently she did the kind of drop catch thing at some point at a family dinner, and everybody's just like, whoa. It's just fantastic.
Speaking of superpowers, right?
Well, I mean, what's the limit on what a human being can do? You watch people doing stuff at the Olympics, and it's like, this is incredible.
Yeah, and the mind too, with memory tricks. The Darren Brown's a very extremely entertaining guy. He's a very total master of reading people mind tricks and everything like that.
Yeah, and we're not really good at producing excellence as a culture. We don't have good mechanisms for supporting people to go and push those kind of limits or find new limits. Imagine if it was possible to get like €100,000 grant that says, okay, so I'm not going to go to college, but I'm going to learn just how far it's possible to throw a ball. Or I'm going to learn, exactly how far it's possible to go playing the violin with one hand and drumming with the other.
Yeah, I think we're going to see some development in that area with crowdfunding as crowdfunding picks up.
It'd be interesting because I just feel like we haven't made an attempt. Sorry, this just kind of hit me now. It's kind of like, what? We haven't actually made a disciplined attempt to map the perimeter of human capability.
I don't think it exists. I don't think there is a perimeter. That's kind of the point.
It'd be nice to look for it and fail to find it.
That's the idea, right? For everybody.
Like we've got the Olympics, we've got kind of math Olympiads, and there are lots of things where we've got competitive frameworks where people are fighting against each other to be the best at something. But I don't think we've got a mechanism for finding new somethings for people to go and try and be the best at.
Well, I mean, in this book, right?
I wonder. It always makes me feel like it'd be nice if we had an ontology for mapping human capability, and then we could go out there and systematically search for okay, so we've got sports to exercise every muscle group except the little finger. So we're gonna have little finger bench press Olympics or something. And we could just go and figure out all the places. Okay, so color matching, right? There's no color matching Olympics.
No. Right? I tried to do that like 4 years ago, and I just couldn't get any listeners. And that was my big capital project, and nobody was into it. And I should have talked to you.
Frontiers of human perception.
That's right. Yeah. No, I'm just joking.
Okay. I wondered for a minute. I was imagining in my head that you had some kind of .com startup.
Yeah, colormatching.com.
Color matching is a skill that could be trained for, say, graphic designers or artists.
No, just BS.
But it's amazingly trainable, right? I mean, color matching, like perfect pitch is really hard to train, but color matching is really trainable. In fact, I've often wanted to do, they have CAPTCHAs, right? Yeah. I've also wanted to do a gender-based CAPTCHA, which just shows you a bunch of colors and you have to name them.
That's good.
And if the answer is blue, 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 it's like male.
Yeah.
Teal, aqua, turquoise, cyan, female.
Right. Yeah. We'll be talking about that, for your new capital, venture capital company, but we'll get to that a little bit later. There's a few more things I'd like to discuss in the meantime.
Cool.
So coming back to social versus technology, you once said that currently social cohesion is more important to develop than more sophisticated cryptography. Can you describe the relationship between social cohesion and cryptography?
All right. So, once upon a time, there was a dream called, crypto anarchy, crypto capitalism, anarcho-capitalism, whatever you want to call it, right? The idea was that you're going to have a bunch of anonymous cryptocurrencies with smart contracts, and that you could build a completely free trade environment with these tools. What we have seen from the DAO is that people are just dumb, right? The people that were piling into the DAO when the DAO was worth $130 million knew that they were taking enormous irrational risks. They knew that the DAO was an amazing target for hacks. They knew that the team standing behind the DAO had never anticipated it getting this big. But once you wind up with this thing of last chance to get your dollar, people behave irrationally. It's herd behavior. It's exactly like yelling fire in a crowded theater. You're stamping on an evolutionary button that people have no control over, and it's in the same class of activity as providing addictive drugs. There's a really fundamental problem with offering people what looks like money for nothing because they're biologically compelled to take it. And as a result, it seems like we're in a position where if we build anarcho-capitalism in those kind of forms, and I have nothing, by the way, against the idea of limited anarcho-capitalism in areas where you've got scarce, non-rivalrous goods. So, for example, I think you could have a perfectly healthy anarcho-capitalist market for digital art, right? Because you don't hit any of the hard property rights problems that make it incredibly difficult to operate anarcho-capitalism in the real physical world. You don't have a point where two people are having a contest over an interpretation because it's in the code. The goods that are being exchanged are pure digital, so there's no scarcity. You can set arbitrary pricing by mechanisms. It's not that anarcho-capitalism can never work for anything, but as a general theory, you get terrible problems in culturally specific definitions of land, and because the land is older than the anarcho-capitalism, you wind up with terrible problems grandfathering it in. If you establish an anarcho-capitalist rule set and then create property like software within that rule set, I don't see any reason that should cause anybody any problems. So that's a very specific point. So the social cohesion problem is, how do we get large-scale agreement about the kind of templates that we want to use? If I'm in a position where I'm an early Bitcoiner, there's large-scale agreement that what we're going to have here is a libertarian currency. And the biggest diversity you get is you get the libertarians versus the anarcho-capitalists who are talking about, in the long run, do we overthrow the state or not? Rough paraphrase. So if we had large-scale social cohesion so that we could make really compelling demands to the government about, say, bicycle lanes, or ending carbon emissions from cars, or bloody hell, let's get together and go to Mars and put some space probes around Alpha Centauri, and could we please just get the space thing going? If we could build really large-scale pressure groups that have applied pressure, raised funds, ran movements, then there's an enormous amount of stuff that we could get done in the world, and everything would progress in a very different direction. But right now, we just are having no luck at all getting that kind of work done, and as a result, things are very, very fragmented and they're very, very drifty.